The day my daughter asked if I remembered what year it was, I knew someone had been talking about me behind my back. Not because I forgot the answer, because I could see the fear in her eyes. Real fear, the kind that doesn't appear overnight. 2 weeks earlier, I had balanced my checkbook, renewed my driver's license, and hosted Sunday dinner for 14 people. Yet somehow, the people closest to me started looking at me like I was becoming a stranger. At first, I told myself they were worried. Then, small things stopped making sense. My daughter suddenly insisted on attending appointments I'd managed alone for years. My son-in-law started asking questions about my finances he'd never cared about before. Even my doctor seemed unusually interested in whether I was forgetting things. The worst part wasn't what they were saying, it was realizing they were all saying the same things. That's when I started paying attention. 3 weeks later, I found a document with my signature on it, giving someone else control over my money, my property, and my future. The signature looked enough like mine to fool a stranger, but I had never signed it. As I sat there staring at that page, one thought kept repeating in my head. Someone wasn't trying to help me, someone was building a case against me, and the person I trusted most was helping them do it. If you've ever had a moment when your instincts told you something was wrong long before you had proof, you'll understand exactly what happened next. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 69 years old, and until last spring, I believed my daughter Melissa and her husband Daniel were the two people I could depend on most in this world. My husband, Robert, passed away 4 years ago after a long fight with cancer. After he was gone, the house felt too quiet, and I naturally spent more time with Melissa and her family. Daniel was the kind of son-in-law other women envied. Helpful before you asked, present before you needed him. I told my friends more than once that Robert must have sent him because nobody that attentive simply appears in your life by accident. I believed that for years. That was my first mistake. The dinner felt completely normal until dessert. Melissa set her fork down carefully and looked at me with eyes full of real worry. She asked gently whether I had been forgetting things lately. Before I could answer, Daniel leaned forward and mentioned repeating stories, misplacing papers, small confusions he claimed to have noticed. I searched my memory for a single example and found nothing because none of it had ever happened. But Melissa believed every word sitting across from me. She had been told these things so many times and so quietly that she had accepted them as fact. That frightened me more than anything Daniel said that evening. I drove home unsettled and spent the night going over everything, trying to find what I was missing. 4 days later, a letter arrived from my bank. It was a notification confirming that a request had been submitted to add a secondary account manager to my savings and retirement accounts. I had submitted no such request. I called the branch immediately and was told the paperwork had been filed in person with what appeared to be my signature. I asked them to freeze everything until I could come in. When I sat across from the branch manager the next morning and saw the documents she placed in front of me, I felt the air leave my body. The signature looked enough like mine to fool a stranger, but I had never signed those papers. And the date stamped at the bottom was a Tuesday morning when I had been 3 states away visiting my sister in Nashville. Someone had forged my name, and I already had a quiet feeling I knew exactly who. Before I tell you what I found next, I want to ask you something I genuinely want to read in the comments. Have you ever had a moment when a small piece of mail or a phone call made your stomach drop before you even fully understood why? Tell me below. You would be surprised how many people have felt exactly that and never told anyone. The branch manager's name was Carol,
and she had kind eyes that turned very serious the moment I slid the bank notification across her desk. She put on her glasses and read it slowly. Then she read it again. She asked me to confirm my full name, my address, and the last time I had personally visited this branch. I told her I had not been in for nearly 2 months. She nodded once and picked up her phone without another word. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a smaller office with a fraud investigator named Patricia, who asked me to sign my name on a plain sheet of paper 3 times while she watched. Then she placed the forged document beside my signatures and studied both for a long, quiet moment. She looked up and said what I already knew. The signatures did not match. Not to her, not to anyone who looked carefully. But she also said something that landed differently. She said whoever had filed this paperwork had practiced. The forgery was not careless. It was patient. That word stayed with me. Patient. Because patience requires time, and time meant this had not started last week. Patricia froze my accounts immediately and opened a formal case. She advised me not to discuss the investigation with anyone in my household until I had spoken with a legal professional. I asked her what she meant by household. She paused carefully and said, anyone with regular access to my home or my personal information. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, thinking about every person who had a key to my front door. That list was short. That evening, I called Richard Lawson, an attorney who had handled our family's legal affairs for nearly 20 years. I had not needed him since Robert's estate was settled, but his number was still in my phone. I told him everything. The dinner, Daniel's comments about my memory, Melissa's concern that had never quite felt like her own idea, the bank letter, the practiced forgery. Richard listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me one question. Had anyone encouraged me recently to see a doctor about memory issues? I said yes. He asked how long that had been happening. I said 3 months at least. He went quiet in a way that told me he was no longer just listening, he was thinking. He asked me to come in the next morning and to bring every financial document I had received in the past 6 months. Then he said something I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said that when someone works carefully and this patiently, they are rarely working alone. Before I tell you what Richard discovered when he reviewed everything the next morning, I want to ask you something, and I truly want to read your answer below. Have you ever ignored a feeling that something was not right, only to find out later that your instincts had been trying to protect you the whole time? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.
Richard's office felt smaller than I remembered when I spread 6 months of financial documents across his desk the next morning. He read everything without speaking. Statements, the fraud report from Patricia, the forged bank paperwork, a property inquiry letter I had assumed was junk mail but had never thrown away. He read each page the way someone reads when they are not looking for what is there, but for what is missing. After nearly 40 minutes, he leaned back and removed his glasses and looked at me in a way that told me whatever he was about to say had been carefully chosen. He said the bank forgery was serious, but it was not the most concerning thing in front of him. I asked him what was. He said someone had submitted a formal inquiry to a guardianship attorney 6 months ago, requesting information about the legal process for assuming financial and personal decision-making authority over an elderly family member. The inquiry listed my address, my age, and a summary of documented memory concerns. I felt the room shift. Richard slid a printed page across the desk. The inquiry had been submitted by Daniel, not in my name, in his own. He had not even tried to hide it because he never expected anyone to look. I asked Richard what guardianship meant in practical terms, and he explained it quietly and carefully. It meant a court could legally determine I was no longer capable of managing my own life. It meant someone else would control my finances, my medical decisions, my living arrangements. It meant I could be moved out of my own home without my consent and have no legal authority to refuse. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the night of that dinner. I asked whether Melissa's name appeared anywhere in the documents. Richard paused and said yes. Her name appeared as a supporting witness on a draft statement describing my memory decline. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I told Richard that Melissa genuinely believed I was struggling. I had seen it in her face. Her concern had been real, even if the information behind it was not. He nodded slowly and said that was actually the most important thing I had just told him. He said Daniel had not needed Melissa to lie, he had only needed her to believe him, and he had spent months making sure she did. Every doctor's appointment Daniel had suggested for me, Melissa had supported, because Daniel had planted the idea first. Every concerned comment Melissa had made at dinner had started as something Daniel said quietly to her days earlier. He had been writing a script and handing her the lines without her ever knowing she was reading from a page. Richard then showed me something that made everything else feel small. A draft guardianship petition, completed, detailed, with my name at the top and Daniel listed as proposed guardian. It had never been submitted to the court, but it was ready. Richard looked at me steadily and said if the bank had not mailed that notification, if Patricia had not frozen those accounts, if I had not called him that evening, this petition could have been filed within weeks. I looked at that document for a long time. For the first time, I understood that I was not looking at a plan that had failed. I was looking at a plan that almost worked. If this story is sitting with you right now, please share it with someone you love, not because it is dramatic, but because the person you are thinking of right now may need to hear it more than you realize. And tell me in the comments, honestly, did you ever underestimate how far someone was willing to go until it was almost too late? I read every word you leave below. Richard suggested I tell Melissa in person, and I agreed, but I spent 3 days finding the courage to do it. When she finally sat across from me at my kitchen table, I placed every document in front of her without saying a word and let her read. I watched her face move through confusion and then disbelief, and then something that broke my heart more than any forged signature ever could. She reached the guardianship petition and stopped. She read it twice, then she set it down, very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started shaking and you do not want anyone to see. She looked up at me and said, "Mom, I thought I was helping you." "I know," I said. "I know you did." She asked how long Daniel had been building this, and I told her what Richard had told me, at least 8 months, possibly longer. She went quiet for a long time and then said something I have thought about many times since. She said, the hardest part was not learning that Daniel had lied. It was realizing how many times she had unknowingly repeated those lies to other people, to me, to my doctor, to family friends who had started checking on me with that careful tone people use around someone they believe is declining. Daniel had never needed to speak to everyone himself. He had Melissa for that, and she had loved us both enough to believe every word he said. We sat together at that table for a long time. A few days later, Melissa confronted Daniel at home. I was not there, but she told me afterward that he stayed calm at first. He said she was misunderstanding the documents. He said the guardianship inquiry had been research, nothing more, just him being responsible and planning ahead for my future. He said the bank situation was a misunderstanding that would get cleared up. Melissa told me she had heard him explain things away before, and it had always worked. His voice was steady, his face was concerned, he looked exactly like a man who had nothing to hide.
But this time she had the documents in her hand, and the documents did not misunderstand anything. For the first time since she'd known him, Daniel had no explanation she was willing to accept. She asked him to leave that evening. Several months later, the fraud case concluded. The forged bank documents, the guardianship inquiry filed in his name, the draft petition, the pattern of manufactured medical concerns, all of it entered as evidence. Daniel's attorney argued he had only been trying to protect an aging family member. The judge noted that the pattern of forgery, financial fraud, and legal manipulation did not resemble protection in any form the court recognized. Every fraudulent document was declared invalid. My accounts remained mine. My home remained mine. My legal rights remained exactly where they had always belonged. Afterward, Melissa stood beside me in the parking lot, and we did not say very much. There was not much left to say. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. Melissa and her children moved closer to my neighborhood. Sunday dinners came back slowly and then steadily. My grandchildren started racing across the same yard Robert spent half his life tending, and I would watch them from the porch with my coffee and feel something I had not felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, something more like stillness. Daniel had tried to take my home, my savings, my independence, and my legal voice. What he could not have anticipated was that in trying to separate me from my daughter, he had actually pushed us closer together than we had been in years. I didn't get justice and lose my family. I got both. And if I'm being honest with you, getting my daughter back meant more than any court ruling ever could. Before we part, I want to ask you one last thing, and I mean this sincerely. What is something life taught you the hard way that you wish someone had told you sooner? Leave it in the comments below. Someone reading your words today may need exactly what you have learned. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone you mean something to. You never know who might need to hear it today.